I work at a Montessori school, which is basically just a really small school with 3 to 4 very tiny classrooms for children. Where I work, the classrooms are on the lower level of a church, and my job is to clean them every night after the class. It would only take me around 2 hours to clean all the rooms, but I work the closing shift at a nearby grocery store as well. I wouldn't get to the school until around 10:30 most nights. Something you should also know is that the church shared a parking lot with an old people's home directly across from it. I will admit, a lot of weird and creepy things have happened at this school, but the weirdest had to be what happened just a couple weeks back. I had just finished cleaning the second room and was beginning to move all of my cleaning supplies to the third room. It was probably around 11:45 at this time, which meant that I was running a little bit behind, or I was trying to rush. As I crossed the hallway to the third room, I hear loud bells echoing throughout the church upstairs. No one had rung the doorbell. Nobody has ever shown up during any of my shifts before, as it was always so late, and both the school and the church were closed hours before. I was a little nervous, so I slowly made my way up the stairs and towards the door. It was one of those wooden doors with big tinted glass windows on it. Trying not to be seen, I looked around the corner to see who was outside. I saw an old woman, probably in her 70s or 80s, standing right outside the door. I backed away before she could notice me. I decided to ignore it. Figured she had just wandered off and one of the attendants at the old people's home would pick her up. I started my cleaning again, mopping the floors of the room. But only a few minutes later, I heard banging echo through the halls. I jumped a little. Then I stopped to listen. Banging stopped for a few seconds and was followed by the old lady yelling from outside. It was hard to make out what she was saying, so I made my way back upstairs, where I could hear clearly what she was calling out for. She was calling for someone named Abby. It was just repeating her name over and over. As I got closer to the door, the woman stopped. I looked around the corner and she wasn't outside the door anymore. It was a little bit unsettling, but I assured myself that someone probably came and got her till they heard her yelling. I turned around and began my way back. Out of the corner of my eye, I see the old lady staring at me through the window right beside the stairs. She looked me in the eyes and yelled, "Abby, help me." Her eyes were wide open and her hair was long and gray. I immediately ran back downstairs and locked myself in one of the classrooms. I took my phone out and called the old people home next door, and I told them the situation, asking if maybe she'd wandered away from them. The lady on the line told me that everyone was there. They would have noticed if anyone had left. They're required to check out. She said that she would double check with security and to stay on the line just in case. While I waited, I heard banging on the window upstairs. A few seconds later, the woman on the phone describes the old lady's features, asks if that was her. I said yes and mentioned that she keeps yelling for someone named Abby. There was a small moment of silence. "Ma'am?" I spoke softly back into the phone. She replied, warning me not to approach her and to find somewhere safe to stay until they could have someone come out and get her. Obviously, this just made me even more terrified. I stayed in the room, still listening to the repeated banging on the window from upstairs. Now, this building was pretty old, and I wasn't sure how long those windows would hold if she kept banging on them. Eventually, I heard some male voices from outside. After what sounded like a struggle, they left. I sat there for a few minutes, just thinking about what had happened. Then I got up and finished cleaning the rooms. The whole situation felt pretty unreal, and knowing that the old lady is in the building across from me still makes me nervous. I never found out who Abby was, or why the lady was trying to get into the church, but I'm just glad I never opened the door. I used to work the register at a local gas station, though I've since left, as there were a lot of strange things that happened when I would work overnight. But this one situation in particular will stick with me forever. I only worked the night shift a few days a week, usually Friday and Saturday. My shifts were usually boring and honestly just a game of trying to stay awake. The only thing I really had to do was stock the shelves and occasionally help a customer. I would get a lot of drunk people or families on road trip, and sometimes even whole groups of friends. But for the most part, it was pretty quiet. On this night, it was around 2 a.m., and I hadn't had a customer in over an hour, so I was starting to doze off a little bit. The desk was around the corner from the entrance, and there was a bell on the door that rang when somebody walked in. So usually falling asleep wasn't too big of a deal. I woke up after a few minutes, hearing the bell ring, and a few seconds later, saw a customer walk in. He looked like a typical 30-year-old man that would come in for some beer or a snack. He walked around for a little bit, down every aisle, looking at everything. Now, I've worked in retail for a long time. I know what it looks like when someone is looking for something specific. But this man had nothing in mind. He was just looking at the shelves, browsing the store. During the day, this is pretty normal, but people don't usually come in at 2 a.m. to browse the gas station shelf. I looked out the window to my left to see if he was filling up his car and was maybe just passing the time. But there were no cars outside. A couple minutes went by before he eventually looked over at me and said thanks, and then walked out. I didn't know what to make of that, but I just figured he stole something small and was just being a dick about it. The whole situation left my mind after a few minutes, and I started to get really tired again. This time, I decided to grab my cart of items to stock and start filling up the shelves to pass the time. I'm not really sure how long I was stocking for, maybe 20 minutes, before I saw a man show up at the end of the aisle I was stocking. It made me jump a little, as I never heard the door ring. This guy was wearing a large hoodie and dark clothes. I pretty much knew right away that something was very off. The man continued down to the back of the store. I immediately went back to behind the counter. I tried not to stare, but I noticed that as he walked down the aisle, he wasn't looking for anything. He was just browsing. It clicked in my head immediately that this was the same guy from just a little bit ago. Benched clothes for... I also came to the realization, probably came initially to go about doing whatever he planned on doing. I started to panic in my head. The man began to come down the aisle closest to the counter. I could see something heavy in his front hoodie pocket. I made a split-second decision to try and prevent any further escalation. I said, "Come back. Out finding anything?" He made eye contact. I could tell he knew exactly what I was trying to do. Approached the counter, not saying a word. Brought his hand out of his pocket, feeling a small handgun. And he grabbed a small pack of gum from beside the counter and placed it in front of me. Said, "It's this." Confused and in shock as to what was happening. Didn't even react for a few seconds, before eventually scanning the gum nervous. Still holding the gun, he took out $1 from his jean pocket, threw it on the counter, then said thanks, walked out. I was in total shock, trying to wrap my head around what just happened. I ended up reporting the situation to the police and calling my manager, who didn't pick up. No updates ever came out of the situation, but it had me on edge for the last few months that I worked there. I'm still unsure of what really happened that night, or what the man's intentions were, but honestly, I'm glad I never found out. I work as a cybersecurity analyst for a large office company in my town. I had just started off my first job in the field, though, of course, I had to work the shift that nobody else wanted to. Working overnight wasn't as terrible as I thought, though. It was actually pretty peaceful. My job mainly consisted of looking through log files to make sure nothing sketchy happened while the rest of the crew was sleeping. This meant that I was always pretty much alone in the office building for several hours. I'd fall asleep pretty often, as staring at a screen for hours on end in the middle of the night was hard on my eyes, and with nobody there to keep me company, staying awake wasn't very easy. I started setting soft alarms on my phone to go off every hour to make sure that I didn't sleep through my entire shift. I had been working this job for about 4 months when this happened, and I actually still work there now. It was a regular night, and my coworker had just finished his shift at 12 o'clock and left the building. A couple minutes later, I got up and started the coffee machine, and then I walked down the main hallway to do a general check for anyone still in the building. This was my regular routine, just to make myself more comfortable. I sat back down at my desk and took my phone out to turn on the alarms, and then continued on with my work. It was about 20 minutes later, and I realized I had never heard the coffee machine beep that done, and I went to check on it. I walked down the hall to the small coffee desk and saw that there was no coffee in the pot, and then I saw that the entire coffee machine was turned off. I thought it was weird, but that's about it. I just turned it back on and went back to my desk. As soon as I sat down, I noticed my phone wasn't where I had left it on the desk. I patted down my pockets and ran back to the coffee desk, but it wasn't there either. I played it back in my memory, and I knew for sure that I had placed it right on my desk right next to my keyboard. I started to get really freaked out and looked around frantically. The way my desk was set up, it was right in the middle of a large room with other desks and computers. I felt like I was being watched as I stood there in the middle, knowing that someone else had to be in there with me. Nervously, I called out in a shaky voice to my friend, really hoping that it was just him playing some dumb prank on me. I waited for a few seconds, but there was no reply. As I stood by my desk, another few seconds went by before I heard a soft shuffling coming from behind the desk in the far corner. Almost immediately after, my phone alarm rang from the opposite corner of the room. My first thought was that there were probably 2 unknown strangers in the room with me. I instantly started running for the door out of the building. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me as I made it out, but I didn't take any chances. I ran across the street to a neighboring gas station. I called 911 with their phone to report the unknown people in our office building. The police arrived quicker than I thought and searched the building. They brought out a man after only a few minutes, though I didn't recognize him at all. They also retrieved my phone, which they found behind some boxes in the corner of the office. He was also found with a small knife in his pocket. The next day, we got a lot more information about what really took place. Apparently, the man was an old employee who had been fired recently before I started working. The man told the police he was trying to scare me in order to get me to leave the building so that he could take back his company laptop. Apparently, he had information that he wanted from it. At least, those were his claims. It all seems really weird to me, and I'm not sure if I even trusted his reasonings to breaking in, but my coworkers did say that they remembered the guy, and he was definitely a little bit strange. I'm glad I got out of there when I did, though, because I'm not sure what would have happened if his plan didn't work and I chose to stay in the building. I did deliveries for a popular fast food place in my town during the end of my high school years. My friends all had jobs there too, but they purposefully scheduled us on separate shifts to prevent us from goofing off. It ruined all the fun, but the money was still nice to have. Mostly I would have no interesting stories about my work days, but this one night was an outlier. It was the weekend and I was working until 10. The orders were coming in steady, so I was doing deliveries one after the other. I was going in, grabbing the bag, driving to the house, and repeating that process non-stop. I think it was around 9 when I got this order, but I can't say for sure because I was kind of mindlessly running the deliveries at this point. I got the bag and pulled up the GPS location for the address, then started driving. Halfway through the drive, I realized this was taking me in a different direction than usual. I'd been this way before, but there weren't a ton of houses over here, so most orders would be in the other direction. I drove, not thinking too much of it, until I saw on the GPS that I was 1 minute away. Looking around, I didn't know a single place I could be 1 minute away from. There was nothing but trees and the road. No houses or shop. Literally nothing. Regardless, I drove until the GPS said I'd arrived, which was just a quarter mile further down. I pulled off to the side and did one quick look around, just in case I was missing something. Then I called the customer. The phone rang for a while, or they finally picked up. "Hey, I drove to the address you put in, but doesn't seem right." "From the address?" I asked, hoping he just made a typo or something. He repeated the address back to me, but it was the same as the one I had in my GPS. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "Wait, I think I see you." I looked up ahead, and down the road, there was a person waving at me. I drove up next to him, but I had a bad feeling in my gut. Rolled the window down, and he immediately started apologizing, saying the address was tricky to find sometimes. He pointed behind him, saying his house was down that road. This road he was referring to looked more like a half-beaten dirt walking trail that went through the forest. I smiled and said it was all right, handing him the bag through the window. He smiled back and thanked me, watching me as I pulled back onto the road and did a U-turn. I looked in my mirror at the man still standing on the side of the road and just thought to myself about how strange that was. Not even a minute into the drive though, something started to feel wrong. My car was bumpy and leaning to the right, and it was getting increasingly worse by the second. It started to feel dangerous to even drive, so I had to pull over. Before doing anything else, I called roadside assistance. I didn't know what was wrong yet, or if it had anything to do with that man, but like I said, I had a bad feeling in my gut. I wasn't taking any chances. After getting off the phone with them, I got out and looked at my tires. My front right tire was busted, and that was the tire closest to where the man was standing, so I put 2 and 2 together pretty quick. I looked back down the road where I came, and in the distance, I saw a figure walking toward me. I hurried into my car and locked the doors. He approached slowly, probably knowing the exact situation I was in. As the man got closer and closer, I contemplated whether or not to risk driving on my busted tire, but by some miracle, a truck came down the road and stopped behind me. They got out and asked if I was okay. I saw the man walking quickly back the way he came. I took this opportunity to tell the man from the truck of my suspicions, and he stayed there with me until the roadside assistance truck came, which was only a minute later. I got the police involved, and I wasn't surprised to find out that the name and address the man ordered with was fake. I don't know what he was trying to do, but making me drive all the way out on an empty road hidden by the forest makes me think it would have been more than just a robbery. When I was 17, I worked at my mom and dad's local restaurant. We were never a busy place, but it was enough to get us by. I ran the cash register and occasionally would help out waiting tables and cleaning. My parents were really nice about giving me flexible hours whenever I needed for school or whatever. Over the summer though, I'd be working full 40-hour weeks, typically from the afternoon until closing. This was my second year working there, and during the last half of summer, my parents had me do the closing tasks for most nights. I'd be there for maybe 15 to 30 minutes after restaurant hours to count the money and clean up. It wasn't difficult or anything, but it was just a tiny bit of extra responsibility. Anyway, on this Friday night, my dad and I had a somewhat busier night than usual. We were the only two workers there, aside from the assistant cook. At closing, my dad helped me out for a few minutes, then locked up the front doors and left for the night. I had plans with a friend after work, so I was rushing to get everything done. When I finished, it was a few minutes past 11. I walked out the back door, which led to a small employee parking lot, but I was taken back when I saw some guy right next to my car. He was looking through my windows, like he was trying to see what was inside. "Hey, wick my car." He looked over at me, showing his face for a split second, then ran into the trees behind the parking lot. I didn't see him long enough to get a good look, but the only feature I could really make out was his long, unkempt and patchy beard. He was a freaky looking guy, and I was feeling really uneasy as I drove away. A couple days passed, and on this night, it was just me and the assistant cook working the closing shift. It was a weekday, so it was slow, but just 20 minutes before closing, a guy walked through the door, sat at a table without saying anything. Now, this was one of those restaurants where you go up to the register first to order, then sit down, so this was kind of weird. I waited for a few minutes until I walked up to his table and asked if he'd like to order anything before we closed. It was then that I saw his long, patchy beard and recognized him as the guy from the other night. I was so caught up in my thoughts I didn't hear his response. Tried to tell him to leave, but I stuttered, and it came out with zero confidence and assertiveness. He looked me in the eyes and asked for a dark roast coffee, completely ignoring what I said. Turned around and put the order in. I thought maybe this was all a misunderstanding somehow. I'm pretty sure that was just me lying to myself to make me feel less scared of him. He sat at the table, staring ahead until his coffee was ready. I walked it over to him and reminded him that the place closed in 10 minutes, so he'd have to leave soon. Of course, he didn't respond, so I walked away. I went up to the assistant cook, who I never really talked to before, and told him about this guy, my uneasy feelings I got from him. He patted me on the shoulder and said to get started on cleaning for him. Then he went to the front. I watched from over the counter as he nicely told the guy to leave. The man got up and made brief eye contact with me from across the restaurant, then turned around and walked to the door. I watched him leave, and as he extended his arm to push the door open, a very easily recognizable object was revealed. A gun wedged in the back of his belt. I thanked the cook and told him everything in more detail so he understood my concerns. He called the police without even hesitating, and while they didn't find the guy, he never came back to the restaurant. I'm grateful for our assistant cook, who I'm keeping anonymous for his own privacy. He could have easily just left for the night and let me deal with my own problems, but his kindness likely saved my life that night. Last year, I started a new job at a grocery store, doing overnight stocking. This was a chain store local to our state, having a dozen or so locations, but the stores themselves weren't that big. Most nights, we'd have a team of 2 or 3 stalkers to get the store ready to go for the next day. I'd worked at a few stores before this, so I wasn't new to the whole overnight stalking gig by any means. On this night, I got into work at 10, but was met with the unfortunate news that one of the guys called off, so it was just going to be me and my manager, Yuri, for the night. Yuri was cool, but he didn't talk much, so it always made for a boring shift. But an hour in, I was working in the chip aisle when Yuri suddenly came to the front of the aisle, looking at me with a concerned face. "Everything okay?" I asked, pulling my earbuds out. He was breathing heavily and asked me if I saw anyone in the store. I said no, and he told me that he thought he saw someone walk past his aisle a minute ago, but when he went to see, there was no one there. I could tell he was nervous, but he tried to blow it off and went back to work. Once he left, I thought about how that was the most I'd ever talked to him, which made me think maybe he did actually see something. I paid more attention, but the next 3 hours were eventless, and it all kind of faded from my thoughts. We both stalked separate aisles and didn't see each other at all. Around 2 a.m., I had completed all of the work he'd given me for the night, so I went to ask him what to do next. I walked past each aisle until I reached the end of the store, then went back down and double-checked every aisle, but he wasn't there. I looked in the back warehouse and in the office too, but couldn't find him. I thought he had to be in the bathroom or taking a break in his car, so I found some work to keep me busy for 15 minutes, then walked around the whole store again, searching for him. All I found was his cart in an aisle. It was the cart I saw him with at the very beginning of our shift, and it looked like he'd stocked half of the boxes, but never got to the rest. Once I saw that, I started getting nervous. I went out the front doors and scanned the parking lot for any signs of him. His car was in the far back near mine, but it was empty. I even checked the sides of the building to see if he was taking a smoke break. It had been nearly 4 hours since I'd last seen him, and I eventually got so worried that I called the police. Police had to contact the store director to get the code to the CCTV cameras, and they replayed the night. I told them about the time he came up to me to ask about the person he'd seen, and when we rewinded it from there, we saw someone walking through the store. They were being careful, hiding and not making any noise, but Yuri was right. Someone else was there. We watched more, and around 30 minutes after Yuri talked to me, this unknown man came up behind him and held Yuri at gunpoint. It was really disturbing to watch, and knowing I was just a few aisles away with no clue made me feel sick. The man forced Yuri to walk, most likely threatening him to be quiet. He led him out to the back of the building, where he was pushed into a car and driven away. The police said that from the looks of it, the two of them likely knew each other, and this was some sort of personal attack. The man was never identified, and as of now, Yuri hasn't turned up. Even though the police were confident it was a personal attack, I didn't take any chances and left that job a few weeks later. But I don't think I'll ever get over the events of that horrifying night. I got a job in my 20s as a storage worker in a local warehouse. It was located on the side of a highway at the end of the town, next to nothing. We always joked about the location and why the owners of the company chose to build the huge warehouse in such a remote, empty area of the town, out of the way of everything. It was probably just cheap land with easy transport from the highway, but it still always felt a little odd to be pulling into a large empty parking lot in the middle of nowhere every night. I always worked overnights with one of my coworkers, who I'll keep anonymous and call him Tyler. Our job was to break down and organize the shipments from the day and move them to their respective place in the warehouse to be stored. Once you do it for a couple of weeks, it becomes very repetitive, easy work that I do while half asleep most nights. Tyler and I were the only two overnight workers, so some days we would be working alone. This happened during Tyler's vacation week, so I was alone at the warehouse from 11 p.m. 5 a.m. every night. It was a Wednesday night, and right away there was something weird when I pulled in. A car was parked in the far corner of this massive empty parking lot. Its lights were off and nobody seemed to be around it, but being all the way out here on private property was very sketchy. I parked next to the entrance door and went inside, then called the cops to come down and have a look. I thought it was probably just some teenagers or a broken down car from the highway, but it was on private property and the fact that it was parked in the far corner just gave me a weird feeling. 20 minutes later, cops came to the front door and told me that the car was empty with no sign of anybody nearby. They were pretty sure it was broken down too, so we got a tow truck to come down and take it away, and then I got back to work. I moved several shipments, which probably took me around an hour, before I was interrupted by a loud bang at the front of the building. I quickly walked down and turned on the front lights, then walked up to the door. A man was standing behind the glass, staring at me, his fist on the door, and looked extremely tired and exhausted. I went closer and talked through the glass. "Are you okay? What are you doing here? It's private property." The man stared at me with a disgusted look. "It's my car," he shouted, banging on the door. I tried to explain, but he kept interrupting me and getting more aggressive, screaming at me to let him inside the building. I threatened to call the cops on him, finally getting him to be quiet. He backed up and gave me one more crazy look before walking away. As I went back to work, I couldn't stop thinking about where that man could have been all this time. I thought maybe he went to a gas station to get a canister for his car, but there's no way he could have walked all the way there and back. And if he got a ride, then he would have been back before the car got towed. I really just couldn't think of anywhere the man could have been that would make sense. Only a few minutes into working again, another bang came from the front door. Don't pull. I was both frustrated and scared, but when I looked through the glass, I was not expecting to see the same cops that were here earlier. They said they got a call from the tow company about some concerning things on the outside of the trunk that I guess nobody noticed beforehand. They questioned me about everything I saw, and I told them about the man who'd come by looking for his car. They left soon after that, and I didn't get any real updates till later in the week, when the cops came back with search dogs, searched the forest around the warehouse. Supposedly, they found dried blood on the back of the bumper, and once they got a warrant to search it, they found even more blood inside of the trunk. They believe the man may have possibly come out to bury a body in the forest near the warehouse, but to my knowledge, they never found any significant evidence. However, the man never went to claim his car from the tow company, and he never showed up again. He just disappeared. It's really unnerving to know how close I was to a possible murderer. For the last couple years working at the warehouse, it really creeped out when working nights alone. I know it wasn't likely, but it would always be in the back of my mind that the man might come back, try to make me pay for what I did. I was doing DoorDash late one night, trying to get some extra money for saving. It wasn't too busy, but I was getting a few orders here and there to make it worth my while. A little after 1 a.m., an order came in for a customer 30 minutes away. It was a long drive, but the payout was good enough for me to accept it. I drove to the restaurant, some local Korean place that looked expensive, then started heading to the house. By the end of the route, started taking me into a pretty bad part of town. I'd been here before with no problems, but as I drove through and looked at all the run-down houses, I started getting uncomfortable. When I got to the address, I parked on the side of the road. It was a very small old house with a cracked and destroyed driveway. Got out of my car and started walking up to the porch with the bag. Right as I was going to set the bag down, my phone rang. Hello? After getting no response, I hung up and quickly finished the delivery and hurried back to my car. As I turned my car on and buckled up, I heard the front door to the house swing open. I looked over and saw a woman waving her arms in the air and running toward my car, screaming at me to wait. It was so bizarre, I was too frozen to react. She ran up to my window and started banging, asking me to help her. I still had no idea what was going on, but I opened the window a crack and asked what she needed. She said her 3-year-old daughter was inside struggling to breathe and that I needed to help her. The woman started going back up the driveway and begged me to come help. Still in a confused state of shock, I got out of my car and started to follow her. But as I did, I noticed her get quiet and less panicky. I started thinking more now that the situation was less chaotic and sudden, and realized how strange this was. I called 911 yet? I asked, stopping on the driveway. She turned around, and it was like her tears and panic were gone. She said there was no time, and started to very obviously pretend to panic again. It looked more like a crackhead having a mental breakdown, not a worried mother. I immediately ran back to my car. She continued screaming, and even ran back down the driveway to the passenger door and started trying to open it. I turned the car back on in reverse as she tried to run in front of my car to come to my side. Once I was clear, put it in drive and went around her, and in that second that I passed the house again, I saw a large figure standing in the upstairs window, watching the whole thing. As soon as I got out of the neighborhood, I dialed 911 and told them the address and situation. When I got a call back from the police, they told me that the woman had a different story, saying she only came out to give me a cash tip. They also noted that she lived alone with no record of having any kids or adults living with her. This only made me more horrified about the situation, but after talking some more with the officer, it was clear that nothing could be done. There was no proof for either of our story, and trying to press charges would be a pointless battle. On top of this, the officer seemed tired and not in the mood to deal with anything, but I knew he was right about me not being able to do much, so it was all left as that. In my gut, I know that she was trying to get me inside the house for dark reasons, especially knowing that she had no kids. The scariest part of it, after knowing everything, was seeing that person inside the house watching us and knowing that he was eerily waiting for me to enter the home. I worked at a 24/7 fast food restaurant a few years back when I was in college. The job wasn't fun or enjoyable in any way. Most of my coworkers were middle-aged people with no personality. I was doing school online though, which meant I had more time to work, so I was cranking out 40 hours a week at least, and even got a promotion to shift lead after a few months. What I didn't realize when I took the promotion was that I was signing to officially be a full-time employee, which meant that they could make me work any shift. Not even a week into it, they put me as overnight, and I couldn't even argue it. Overnights were a pain in the ass because I'd be the only one there, so if the drive-thru got backed up, then I'd be hustling non-stop, without any breaks. On the flip side though, sometimes it would be completely dead, and I'd just be standing around all night on my phone. This was one of those nights. I was in the back of the kitchen, sitting on a pile of boxes and scrolling through my phone, just trying to pass the time, when my headset rang to alert me that a customer was in the drive-thru. I got up and went to the computer, then asked what they would like to order. Nobody said anything, so I turned and looked up at the drive-through camera, and the lane was empty. No cars in the drive-through, or even in the parking lot around the restaurant. The system never really falsely beeps like that, though. There was a slight storm outside, so I figured a raindrop or a flash of light must have tripped the sensor somehow. Stayed by the drive-through window for a few minutes, and my headset beeped again. This time I quickly looked at the cameras, caught a man walking past the drive-through lane. He was wearing a thick hoodie and a face covering, but quickly walked out of the camera's view. Where the restaurant was, there wasn't anywhere else he could have parked or walked from unless he was walking on the side of the main road. I watched the cameras to see if he'd come back, but after 10 minutes of no activity, I just went back to my phone. 15 more minutes went by before I got another beat, and when I checked the cameras, that same man was there, but this time he was standing in the drive-through lane. "And I hope, sir." After a moment, he started reciting an order for a small meal. I wasn't supposed to serve people in the drive-thru unless they were in a vehicle, so I told him I couldn't accept his order. He stood there, letting the rain soak him as he just looked at the screen and didn't speak. I thought about telling him to leave, but I didn't want to escalate things if I didn't have to, so I just waited. After a minute, he started walking down the drive-through lane toward the side of the restaurant where the window was. I rushed over and latched the window shut, and not even a second later, the man appeared outside. He had his hood and mask still on, but he looked to be in his late 40s, long black hair and a dead look in his eye. He watched me through the window and stood outside like he was waiting for me to talk to him. There was something about his look that really freaked me out, kept me from speaking. Then he softly said, "Boss." I nervously said no and just stayed where I was while the man continued looking at me. He asked again and knocked on the window, but after a few seconds, turned, and as he walked away, a loud scraping sound ran along the side of the building. Checked the cameras to make sure he left, and luckily, he didn't come back. During the next hour of my shift, though, I was thinking about that scraping sound. I decided to take out the trash to the dumpster and take a quick look. On the side of the wall, under the drive-through window, was a long scratch, looking like it was made from a knife dragging along the buildings. I called the police after that, but the man couldn't be identified from the grainy camera footage mixed with the heavy rain and fog. The man never turned up, and I'll never know exactly what he was planning on doing that night. But seeing as he had a knife ready in his hand, I assumed that if I had taken his order and opened that window, then that would have been the last thing I would have ever done.